Wonderful. All right, everyone. Welcome to our 8th US-Pakistan virtual academic exchange as part of the Fulbright program and funded by the US Education Foundation for Pakistan and Florida International University, University of Management and Technology, and many other universities that are working with us and helping us today. Today, we are honored to have two highly respected scholars thinking about the issue of religion and the environment. So as we are, as a world, heading towards kind of major crisis with regards to the climate and the sustainability of communities across the planet to live, the big question for us becomes, what are ways that we can think about religion, the language of religion, the symbols of religion, and religion as a whole, not just sort of traditional religion, but also newer forms of religion as ways of helping to create a more sustainable planet, thinking about sort of a planetary ethos for spirituality. And particularly what's very important about that is trying to bring in a dialogue between societies in the global north and the global south. And that's part of what we're trying to do here today with the United States and Pakistan, is to get perspectives from both sides, because the needs and the challenges and the capacities for both societies and how citizens from both societies will tackle and understand the challenge is very important. And the conversation is very important as well, to be able to understand what are the larger priorities and to think about what are coordinated ways by which we as a society can come together. And it's not simply a political issue in terms of political leadership, but it's something that at a social level, at an economic level, at a citizen to citizen level, at a intellectual level, even at a narrative level, something that we all have to work on. So with that, I am very honored and very excited today to have two leading scholars in the field. The first I will introduce is Professor Whitney Bauman. So he is a good friend and colleague at Florida International University in the Department of Religious Studies. And his focus is generally religion and science, or religion, ecology, and nature. And what he's interested in is questions regarding religious beliefs, insights, doctrines, and practices that shape the metaphysical world around us. So kind of thinking about religious sentiment is something that is important for him. Whether you're within a religious tradition or outside of a religious tradition, kind of being inclusive of the idea of religion and what that means. His work answers big questions with regards to thinking about how the human relationship with the natural world has evolved, and also challenge the sustainability of the climate. And so this is kind of one of the big challenges, is how do we think about ethics and live responsibly as human beings in the natural world? And that's kind of the topic of his work. He's written extensively. You know, he's also not just a Fulbright scholar, but he's gotten the Humboldt Fellowship, many other very prestigious fellowships, and has lived around the world. I know he spends some time in Miami, sometimes in Berlin nowadays. So he can also give us somewhat of a European perspective as well. His work includes articles that are in theology, creation, and environmental ethics, a very well lauded book, Religion and Ecology, Developing a Planetary Ethic. So he's a leading scholar, and we're very honored to have Professor Bauman as our lecturer. And then I will introduce Professor Yahya as our discussant from Comsats University in Islamabad. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Bauman for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll begin with the discussant. Professor Bauman.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Iqbal, and it's very nice to be here with all of you, really around the world. So this is a great experience, and it sort of plays right into my hopes to talk about developing planetary understanding of the self and planetary understandings of ethics and religion and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to set a little timer here so I don't go over, because, you know, without that, I do like to talk. Um, Anybody with those three letters, but at the end of their name likes to talk. So anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about the just basically religion and ecology, which may seem sort of two strange things to put together. But as a field, it's about 50 years old now, and sort of an academic field. And there's all sorts of ways that also activists and religious communities are becoming more and more aware of things like climate activism and environmental justice and these sorts of things. So the way that I've been thinking about this is sort of the development of a critical planetary romanticism for the Earth, or CPR for the Earth. And this is sort of my blanket sort of understanding of what religions can do for an ailing planet. Because I think religions at their best help us reattune to the worlds that we live in, reattune to bodies, reattune to not just humans, but human suffering, but also reattune to the non-human world as well. So religions help us, I think, to connect, and that may seem odd in a world that politicizes the ways in which religions are divisive. But this is sort of how I think about religion when I'm thinking about religion and nature, or religion and ecology. And sort of one of the big problems is sort of how we have thought ourselves outside of the world. So usually when I start a lecture like this, I'll ask people what you think. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the word nature? And inevitably, I'll get things like the sun, or trees, or the ocean, or whales, or mountains, or so on and so forth. But very rarely do I get me, myself, my human body, the rooms that we're sitting in, the computers we're talking on, right? And so my question then is, how have we written ourselves outside of nature? And how can we write ourselves back into the rest of the planetary community? And this is a role that I think religions can help with. And I start here with just a quote from one of my colleagues, Carol Wayne White. And she says, with keen awareness of how deeply embedded we are with myriad nature, and how our destiny is entangled with other natural processes, humans continually revise, correct, or even forfeit older perspectives as newer forms of knowledge become available. And this is her way of thinking about religion as well, is that religion is reattunement. Religions are constantly helping us to shift to changing environments and changing contexts around us. So they're not these static things in the past, but they're living traditions, and they ought to be thought of as a verb rather than as a noun. So when I'm thinking of religion here as reattunement, I'm thinking in some ways about the sort of old roots of this Western word religion, coming out of Latin, which is to reinterpret, or to bind things together. So it's reinterpreting context and trying to put things together into a meaningful whole. And part of this, I think, is just humans as planetary creatures, just as much as birds fly, or dolphins swim, or dogs bark. Humans make meaning. We can't help ourselves from it. Even atheists make meaning of the world around them. And when someone's world is meaningless, we tend to think there's something wrong, right? That they need help. So humans, for whatever else we do, we make meaning of the world. We may not be the only meaning makers, but that's something that really defines what it means to be human. And it's an ongoing daily process, right? This meaning making, this reattuning to our world and trying to make sense of the worlds around us. And this definition, this definition of religion is very broad, right? It can be sort of the traditional world religions and things like meditation, or it can be something like biking, or surfing, or walks through nature, or fishing, right? There's all sorts of things that can help us sort of spiritually reattune to the worlds around us. So some people don't like this definition because it makes religion, everything into religion or potentially into religion, but I think that's okay. Um, what do I mean by religion as reattunement? Well, there's all sorts of what we might call aesthetic reattunement, right? Shifting cosmologies help to reorient ourselves in the world, and religions are often a part of that. Alternative cosmologies from, I'm thinking about sort of like in Christian traditions, the kingdom of God, right? The world to come is this sort of imagined new world to show the injustice of the world that we live in, right? And something to work towards, right? Or in Islam, right? The time of day, right? The daily prayers really help us to orient ourselves into the time of day, the rotation of the earth, the cardinal directions, right? Religions help us through their rituals, help us orient us towards seasons and sort of life stages, right? This is what I mean by sort of aesthetic reattunement. There's also ethical reattunements. So the Buddha witnesses lots of poverty and then lots of wealth and charts a middle way, right? This is an ethical sort of reattunement to the world that he experiences. Moses saying, let my people go out of Egypt and slavery, right? This is an ethical reattunement, right? There's injustice and we ought to reattune somehow to the worlds in which we live in a more just way. Also, attunement works for musical level, whether it's chanting, singing, again, the call for prayer. These sorts of things reattune us, our ears and our bodies to the vibrations of sound around us. We can think about the bodily reattunement in religion through yoga, meditation, dancing, ritual, and pilgrimage, right? And what these do to our bodies through fasting, right? These are bodily reattunements that help anchor us into the rest of the world around us. We can think of religions and epistemological or knowledge reattunements, right? That especially ones that I like here and that I deal with most because they fit well with my postmodern sensibilities are the ones that are about trickster figures, or really that mess up when you think you know what the world is, a trickster figure is there to tell you that you don't know anything. Or iconoclasts, right? Smashing our idols and our icons so that we don't equate them with the one true reality, this sort of thing. We can also think about reattunements and texts, right? Hermeneutics of text are constantly being rethought based upon new experiences and contexts and new findings in the archaeological record, this sort of thing, right? So we're constantly in this process of reinterpreting or reattuning the text to our own contexts in the world today. So there are multiple types of reattunement, and they're also processive and ongoing. So that's kind of what I think of when I think about religion. And so at our current moment, I would say there are two very large phenomena that redefine our current moment of reattunement. And that would be globalization and climate change, right? There's no person, religion, culture, thought system that can escape either one of these phenomena on the planet today. And I think this also places us in a little bit of unknowing, right? In a little place of unknowing, right? Climate change, no one knows how to solve it. We know things that we can do, but we don't know, we can't sort of manage the whole complex, wicked problem that is climate change. Nor do we know exactly what the effects are going to be, or what types of worlds are going to be possible in the future as we move through climate change, as we move through the increase of that 2.0 degrees global wide temperature. Also with globalization, right? It wasn't only 100 years ago, and even maybe in some places today where one was born and died and within a 100-mile radius of where, their whole lives, right? Now we are interconnected every day with global flows of information, energy, materials, right? We are, even if we don't travel that much, as many people in the global north do, we are intersected on a daily basis by by information, energy, and materials from around the globe. So we really have a different sort of experience of the world than most of human history has had because of these two phenomena. And so I think this takes a little bit of what I would call viable agnosticism. We can know some things, but we can't know the whole picture. We can only know from where we stand in this sort of thing. And Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, the Jewish political philosopher who fled Nazi Germany and ended up in the United States during the 20th century, wrote this about this sort of viable agnosticism. She says, "We know from experience that no one can adequately grasp the objective world in its full reality all on its own, because the world always shows and reveals itself to him from only one perspective, which corresponds to his standpoint in the world and is determined by it. If someone wants to see and experience the world as it really is, he can do so only by understanding it as something that is shared by many people. Only in the freedom of our speaking with one another does the world, as that about which we speak, emerge in its objectivity and visibility from all sides." So what she's trying to say there is that many perspectives together give us a better understanding of the worlds in which we live than just one alone. And that's also part of what I mean by this viable agnosticism. Okay, enough about that. All right, so this current moment of reattunement, let me focus a little bit then on what I mean by each of these, right? So globalization means this fossil-fueled world in which we live that gives us the space-time crunch, right? We can just hope, dream, and desire much more than humans in the past can, simply because by virtue of our fossil-fueled technologies that allow us to do more in one day than was ever before possible, right? So we have this space-time crunch. The world is much smaller, time is much faster because of this globalization. This idea of living on a single planet, right? We only have this Earthrise image from one of the Apollo missions. That image of the Earth from outer space is this little single planet that's only been in our imagination since the 1960s, right? But this idea that we live on a single planet, and all religions, all histories, all humans, everything that's happened in human history and in evolutionary history has happened on this one single planet, right? And that's part of this, what I mean by globalization, is this sense of being together on this single planet. Globalization, again, means this introduction to multiple truths, right? We're confronted every day by truths from other religions and philosophies and cultures in a way that human beings haven't really been before this time. Yes, we had the silk trades and the spice trades, and we had European colonization and this sort of thing, but now we have this thing that we're communicating through, right? The internet, where we can be across the world and at the click of a few keystrokes or mousepad clicks, right? And things are moving a lot faster than even during those earlier periods of interaction. But again, one of the things I think that globalization allows us to see is that all traditions are hybrid, right? There are no pure traditions. The monotheistic traditions Judaism, Islam, and Christianity sort of form one another, but they also take from the traditions in the ancient Near East and Zoroastrianism and so on and so forth, right? The same with Vedic traditions, right? They all shape one another. And so there's all this flow of even in pre-colonial era, right, of traditions, so that there really are no pure traditions, right? We're all sort of mixed up together. And I think of this as like a hermeneutics of globalization and pluralism, right? Because we live in a globalized world now, we can look back and see that there have always been these a pluralistic sort of understanding of the world, and that these traditions have been mixed up together. Globalization is also about this sort of economic tied togetherness and the consumption and economics that comes from the sort of globalization of neoliberal capitalism, for better and for worse. So this is what I think partly, is the negative part of globalization, is this great economic inequity, right? And the between the haves and the have-nots, and the siphoning of resources and energy and materials to certain peoples at the expense of others, right? And globalization also allows for this type of economics and consumption to occur. And of course, there are many religious responses to globalization. Darn it. There are many different religious responses to globalization. There are people that are, things like, I would say, protest at Standing Rock, or Extinction Rebellion, or liberation theology movements in the earlier part of the latter part of the 20th century. These are all, I think, religious responses to globalization. There's also religious responses to globalization that we see now as in terms of a return to sort of conservatism and purity, and sort of, and on the part of nation states, a return to nationalism, right? That's a response to globalization, right? Let's get out of this, right? And return to our roots and our origins, right? That's also a response that I for one don't think is that helpful, but nor is the just continuation of things as normal. So what to do, right? And then the related phenomenon of climate change, right? As a related and perhaps not direct phenomenon, but related phenomenon, is climate change, right? And so what does climate change mean, sort of, in an embodied way? It means, what Bill McKibben, environmental activist and writer in the United States, calls the end of nature, right? There is no more pure nature, right? If we ever thought that there was some sort of pure nature untouched by humans, there is no more, right? Because climate change means that everything across the planet has been affected by human forcings of climate change. So we can't think of nature as something that is out there and other than human, right? Whatever nature is, it has to include humans and human technology. So this human nature technology spectrum, right? And for me, there's at least one silver lining, right? Is that we finally might, through climate change, realize ourselves as a part of the world rather than managers of it, right? Or above it, right? We can't manage the world, and precisely because we are inside of it, we are a part of it. We're a part of the world thinking and acting upon itself, right? Part of the planet thinking and acting upon itself. So humans are not exceptional to the rest of the natural world, but we are citizenships. So we are citizens on this planetary community. And so we have to start thinking, I think, in terms of what urban planners have identified as wicked problems and uncertainty. So wicked problems simply mean that there's not a single solution to problems such as climate change, and every solution that we come up with is going to result in more problems that we then have to think about later. It's going to have all these unforeseen consequences. There's no more heroes that will save the world, but rather we have to continuously play this game of whack-a-mole and try to figure out how we're going to solve the next problem, right? And there's no point of arrival at which we don't have to continue this sort of like problem-solving process. And so there have been lots of religious responses to climate change. There's several groups, umbrella groups. One is the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale University. It sort of catalogs all the different religions in the world and how they respond to environmental issues. And they have bibliographies and lists of activist groups and this sort of thing. And there are other groups that look at sort of emerging religious traditions that might fall under religious naturalism, right? So these religious naturalists will say, well, maybe the world religions, because they were created, thousands of years ago and weren't created to deal with climate change. Maybe they just can't deal with climate change. So we need to come up with new religions, religions that might look at sort of hiking as a spirituality, or think about evolution as a way of orienting ourselves in a world, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, and these sorts of things. So there are lots of people that are looking at climate change and trying to respond to it in a religious or spiritual way. And I really understand this sort of moment as an apocalyptic moment, not apocalypse as in the end of things, but apocalypse is always, right, an unveiling and an uncovering of something new, right? So the death of something for something new to emerge. And one of my colleagues, Catherine Keller, writes about it like this. And she defines our apocalyptic moment and says it calls for apocalyptic mindfulness, which will help us not to get over our grief of the world that we're losing, but to move out of isolating paralysis and into healing action. It attends respectfully to the difficulty shifting experience of fear, loss, hope, anger, and love. It tunes carefully to the therapeutic dynamics of grief. So part of what religions can help us do then is to work through the ecological grief that we experience as climate shift and species die and ecosystems change, evolve and change, or as things go extinct, right? As Miami Beach sinks into the ocean, right? This sort of thing, right? As the Everglades begin to disappear, right? So how can religion help us, perform sort of collective grieving over this and environmental hospice so that we can then begin to constructively work together towards new worlds and new possibilities for the worlds in which we live. And so this is where I think something like a critical planetary romanticism comes in, right? So what do I mean by this, right? And this is sort of my own understanding of a nature religion that can help us reattune to the worlds around us. It doesn't have, but one does not have to convert to this. One can find these strands of romanticism in virtually all the world religions, right? What I mean by romanticism is basically this resurgence of the understanding of nature as alive and valuable, right? That humans are not the only thing that matters. Nature is not just dead stuff, but it's vital. Other animals have spiritualities and language and communication and tools, and we're not the only thing in town, right? And there's all these new sort of pseudo new, not really new things, but it's more like return to old thinking. But there's ways of thinking called the new materialisms that see agency and values distributed throughout the natural world. Also, this has been called neo-animisms. This sort of thing, but you can find earth-loving traditions in virtually all the world's religions that say something like, we are a part of nature and nature has value in itself. It may not be the dominant strand in a world religion, but you can find them there, even if it's a minor voice. But also this idea that we are entangled, right, and this through our bodies. With other bodies, with the rest of the planet, right? Even our guts and the microbiome, right? Our bodies are little ecosystems that reflect the ecosystems around us. And most of the cells in our bodies are not human, right? They're from other critters that make up our bodies. So we are really evolutionarily, ecologically entangled with the rest of the planet. And what do I mean by planetary? So by planetary, I'm sort of using this in distinction from the global view of the world, right? So this comes from a post-colonial thinker, Gayatri Spivak, but she juxtaposes the global with the planetary. So the global view is sort of the objective view from above. The planetary view is the view from within, the embedded view, the contextual view, right? So we can't ever see the whole world as it is in one, but we can only see it from where we stand, and then work with others to get other perspectives about the world in which we live, right? I also mean by this, we can't be sort of parochial or nationalistic in our thinking, right? We have to think of ourselves as planetary citizens. So nationalisms and parochialisms don't work. And this includes both politically, but also environmentally thinking. Place-based ethics and environmentalism have often meant, let's take care of this place, regardless of some other places, right? So this is in the environmental justice movement, this has been called NIMBY, not in my backyard, right? Thinking, right? We don't want this toxic stuff in our backyard. Well, where does it go? Usually to the poorest people of color, and it pollutes their environment, right? So we need to move from not in my backyard to not on planet Earth, right? and sort of thinking about this idea of planetarity. So I've called this, what we need is a polyamory of place. We have to love specific places because we live at the human scale, but we can love multiple places, right? And see how they connect together in the planetary community, not just a single place. But also what I mean by planetarity is that as a focus on our animality, right? That we are earthling. we are earthlings. And so we are planetary citizens among many other planetary citizens. We're not the only things, once again. So the earth is not for us, but we are for the earth. It's sort of a shift that I would say in terms of our thinking about planetary thinking. And then finally, what do I mean by critical? Well, we can't just have a naive romanticism, right? That we all have this single experience of the earth, right? But rather, we need to think multi-perspectively about this. Different embodiments shape how we understand the natural world around us differently. So we need these critical theories of race, gender, queer and sexuality studies, disability studies, class, post and decolonial studies, animal studies, affect theories, right? We need all these sorts of things to help us really scrutinize the ways in which we understand the natural world and how they might be understood differently, and how our own understandings of the natural world might cause violence towards other bodies, right? And this sort of thing. So we need these sorts of critical theories, and these critical theories are not something that are inimical to religious traditions, right? We have, again, negative thinking, iconoclastic thinking, apophatic thinking, trickster traditions. Most mystical strands of religious traditions have been involved in critiquing orthodoxy in some way. So these critical ways of thinking and postmodern and deconstructionism have deep roots, I think, in these earlier religious sort of negative ways of thinking or critical ways of thinking. But I think that this sort of critical planetary romanticism, right, is a way for us that it's something that can be practiced from multiple religious perspectives, but might help us to keep our eyes on the ways in which our worlds cause violence towards humans and non-human others, so that we might be able to shift them and create worlds that create more flourishing for the entire planetary community and not just a few. So that's sort of where I'll end. And I was within my time. I still have 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Whitney. I appreciate that. So now what we will do is we will now shift to Professor Yahya. And so Professor Yahya is currently a lecturer at Comsats University in Islamabad. And he's also currently completing a doctorate at Dongbei University of Finance and Economics in Dalian, Liaoning in China. He has previously also had education from Institute of Management Sciences in Peshawar and the University of Agriculture in Peshawar as well. He's written a lot of very interesting papers, single and co-authored. And the one that I was most interested in when I saw his research was the impact of green religiosity on green product switching behavior in Pakistan, the role of green personal values in green altruism. So I thought that was a very interesting, and particularly kind of thinking about the issue of climate change and how do we affect the behaviors of people. Very little research has been done in Pakistan. So we're very honored to have Professor Salman Yahya to serve as the discussant for Professor Bauman's lecture. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Yahya.
Thank you, Professor Iqbal, for giving me the opportunity and for having me here. And it was a very wonderful talk from Professor Whitney. It was a very new narrative for me. I mean, having the concept of, planetary citizen. So it's very appealing. And yes, as mentioned by Professor Iqbal, yes, the discipline, the idea of religion influencing our behavior, our tendency toward the environment, the way we treat environment, it's very appealing. It's very interesting. Based on that, I conducted some research, and from the lecture, even I got many new insights that can be for my future studies and for my interest. Well, it's very obvious. This is the most wicked problem today, very pressing issue, the environment. Many people, many scholars are doing their best in different perspectives dealing with the environment. So the religion seems very interesting and very appealing to me that it can be a good idea of appealing people from the perspective of the religion. And well, I have a very little research as compared to Professor Whitney. I had the opportunity to see his work, and I was astonished. It was enormous work, enormous contribution in that particular field. So much more insightful work I have seen. I had the opportunity to saw those papers and the work. So I was really impressed with that. After my analysis of the work, the professor, like different professors like Professor Whitney are doing, I was wondering about how different religions are treating the environment. And yes, we know that all of the religions, I mean, in a varying degree, they have the connection with the environment. They have the preachings for the protection of the environment. So if it is the Buddhism, the concept of karma, I mean, the consequences that what we do today will have the consequences in the future. So if we apply it to the environmental context, yes, it's very true. In the Christianity, we have hundreds of verses in the Bibles that encourage us in shape us our behavior to treat the environment preciously and keep the environment and the resources as a sacred material. Same goes for the Islam and the Quranic verses and the Prophet sayings. So obviously we see that there is in the preaching of the different religions, we are told, we are guided, we are even directed to treat the environment and the people around us with the care. So yes, this perspective, very interesting, very appealing, and I feel after the enormous work, there are still different things, different aspects that we can explore. So I'm not being skeptic, but I would say that I have to mention some of the challenges because I'm the proponent. I feel this is the very right direction. We can do it. But as a researcher and as something that appeals me, I was concerned about the challenges that after, we had a very long, our researchers have a very long way. They did conducted research in different aspects. But still, I was wondering about the challenges. What challenges still we face in this context, and that we as a community, as the people, researchers who are interested in this area can and should deal with it. So the first thing that I have came across is that the people incompleteness of the religious observance and compliance. We know that there are many dietary laws, consumptions of different food. For instance, if I say I speak about the Christianity, so it prevents us from they have the dietary laws. It prevents us from consuming the pork or certain seafood or excessive use of alcohol. If we talk about the Islam, so it gives you, it guides you, and it asks you to pray 5 times a day. But if we see the compliance is very low. So all of our narrative, we feel the religion can be a very powerful tool for changing the people behavior. But the challenge we feel, and I feel, and we face, and that we should further understand is that there are people who have a very less compliance of the religious guidelines. So in such situation, as researchers, as people, educators of this particular ideology, what we should do, we should think about that. We should think further researches, and we should have a very further understanding on that. The second thing which I was in that time span, I was doing some literature review as well. I had the 1 week time span, so I was conducting some research. So I came across some books and some surveys. So the surveys which astonished me, and I should say shocked me, was that the people who have a more affiliation with the religion, they are not as pro-environment as those who don't have any affiliation with the religion. So again, our narrative is based on that the religion can be a powerful tool for changing their tendency toward the environment. But the people who have, low affiliation or no affiliation with the religion they feel more connected with the environment as compared to the those who have more affiliation with the religion. So that is again another challenge, and we have to probe further that what we can do here. The third challenge that I would say is the lack of educational programs for the religious scholars. I mean, the preaching, if the way I see a different thing is that the religious scholars are more focused on the relationship with the God. The more preaching, the sermons, they are based on those lectures, those sermons are based on the relationship of human with the God. In the second degree, I would say the relationship of the people with the other living being, with the other people, and with the less magnitude. And unfortunately, with no magnitude, with no lectures and sermons regarding the relationship of human with the environment. So I feel there is another challenge, that is their lack of education, their lack of awareness about the environment. So as a researcher, as an educator of that particular ideology, I feel that we should also go for such researches, such understanding of them, and what we can do to educate them and even include them. I mean, if we see scholars from different universities are engaging in dialogues and doing and conducting research and sharing our ideologies, but we lack in including those people who are the preachers, the religious scholars. So my point of view is that we should also include such people in our conversation to educate them, to aware them, and to influence them. And I'm sure from their religion, they have the guidelines, but I don't know, we should further investigate that what are the issues that they are more focused on their relationship with the God, but there is no focus on the relationship of human with the environment. So that is another challenge that I feel that we should think about that. And the last one, the second last one, is the religious mind tendency towards science, toward technology, and toward environmentalism. So every time, this is my understanding, that every time they see a new concept, they are very skeptical of that. They, they feel that is something that is not related with them. That is something kind of agenda. So with that mindset, again, I feel that we have to understand them better. For them, it might be, kind of the concept. I should put it in the way it's a kind of heterodox for them. And lastly, as Professor Whitney said, if we want to become a planetary citizen, we should have harmony. And the last challenge that I'm going to talk about is that the inter-religion tensions. And that is very unfortunate that we see that the religious scholars, they have it's very often that we have interfaith dialogues. And there might be some interfaith dialogues, but there would be no discussion on the environment or behavior toward the environment or behavior toward other different important things beside the God. So these are the challenges, and I would like Professor Whitney to comment on those and give us a guideline about those challenges that we can further work on it, and what could be the methodology and what could be the way of doing it. So thank you, Professor Iqbal, and over to you, Professor Whitney.
Thank you, Professor Yahya. Well, let me just summarize real quickly for Whitney, just so that he knows kind of what are the things. So basically, I think part of it is that the situation in Pakistan is quite different from the United States, right? So the context and the challenges that you're facing. So it's basically Pakistan is a middle income country that's going through industrialization itself right now. And it is trying to develop its economy to expand. Again, kind of following on what the West did, but it's still in an earlier stage, right? In terms of developing its economy. On top of that, then the country has also gone through very, say, challenging times with regard from the time of, the war in Afghanistan. I think really had a very strong impact on Pakistan with the geopolitics from the Zia al-Haq years until basically the last decade, and sort of the connections between the two. And so I think that's, the context that Professor Yahya is talking about. So he's really, what you're seeing here is that people who tend to be more highly educated, perhaps a bit more secular, are going to be more interested in sort of environmentalism and religion, and sort of this idea of a planetary ethic. There's not as much interreligious dialogue, and if there is, it's really not focused on solving contemporary problems. It's more about just kind of making sure that there's some sort of harmony within society so people don't kill each other. So it's it hasn't developed to that level that you're trying to now, through sort of some sort of interfaith cohort, solve larger sort of global problems. So I think that's another thing that's important. And then, yeah, I think that generally trying to, bring in, how do you, and this is a challenge even in the United States, right? So how do you bring a liberal or a newer perspective with regards to religion? How do you give it authority compared to a traditional way of understanding religion, right? So, especially within Islam and Judaism, Christianity as well, the world is made for man, right? And so the man sort of uses the earth as necessary, and you're advocating something quite different, which is basically thinking about the idea of us as being part of the world, right? So how does that transition maybe take place within Christianity or within liberal sects of Christianity? And could those be instructive for Islam? So those are a lot of big things, but I'll turn it over to you. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. There's also, the host has spotlighted your video. Okay. Okay, sorry. There's also good questions in the chat I see, which I do want to return to this question about indigeneity and indigenous traditions and also misogyny, genocide, and these sorts of things and world religions. But we'll come to that, Sarah, in just a moment. Those are great questions. So first of all, let me just say I really appreciate your more social scientific work on this, and people, I think, especially like me, who are do more sort of like intellectual history or ideas and theory and this sort of thing, really need this in order to stay focused on the reality of what's going on the ground. And for sure, there's all these sorts of things. Robin Globus Feldman has just written this whole book on sort of doing more social scientific data on sort of evangelicals, especially in the environmental movement in the US. And yes, the more sort of evangelical you are, the less sort of you have concern for climate change and this sort of thing. I think part of that is a generational thing. And if you look at the even younger evangelicals, they're more concerned than the older ones. I think also part of it has to do with the way in which I think that the difference on let's say, the Christian left and the Christian right are larger than the differences between the Christian left and the Muslim left, right? So that the differences within a religion are much more than between religions on these political spectrums. And then part of that has to do with what you're saying, education and this sort of thing. So yes and yes, those are really valid points. And I guess I would say that, this is where we have to, I think, be careful of becoming be careful of falling into something like eco-piety. Well, this tradition, Christianity, it's the uber destructive tradition because it has the patriarchal God that says, women were created from Adam's rib and humans are above the earth and we should subdue the earth. Well, yeah, but there's also other traditions in there, right? That Adam comes from the Adamah, the dirt, where the mud, Adam is the mud creature and actually a non-gendered mud creature, until another creature who is his helpmeet, who is Adam's helpmeet, is you know. So there's all different types of hermeneutics and all different types of traditions within every tradition. So these are really complex, and I think that it's not about sort of cherry picking and ignoring the violent things. I think we have to confront. Every tradition has to confront its own bad stuff in terms of promoting slavery and sexism and animal abuse and sort of being anti-earth, right? But I think that we also should not just throw these traditions out, because there's lots of good stuff there in terms of how we can learn to be non-sexist and non-racist and learn to live with the rest of the natural world. So I think that's part of my answer, is these are complex things, and it takes time that we don't have, I guess, for these big shifts to occur. I mean, it was, it's only been since the mid 20th century, not even 100 years, that people have been really aware of an environmental movement, right? But yet we have, and I'm given hope by certain things like, I'll put some of these organizations in here, like, this concept from of eco-halal that's begun by some green Islamic organizations, or eco-kosher, right, by Jewish organizations, or looking to things like the sabbatical and the biblical sabbatical and jubilee years in terms of forgiving third world debt, right? And this sort of thing. So, I mean, the Pope and Bono were together on that, right? And in 2000. So these are not small figures that were thinking with these religious traditions to try to forgive significantly third world debt, for instance. And so, yeah, I guess what I would want to say is that's true. And every single tradition has its own sects and denominations and factions and political ideologies, but why let the earth denying traditions have the whole thing? I guess why not try to fight for it a little bit? And I think, but I think you're absolutely right. We can't also idealize it and say, oh, great, here are these great ideas and religion, so therefore this religion's green, or here are these ideas about queerness in these religions, and therefore these religions aren't homophobic, right? So I think that's a false step to take as well. But I do think that this continual process of reinterpretation and reattunement for context is helpful in highlighting the deep green strands and some of our rituals and traditions and this sort of thing. And so over time, I think my hope is that, just like any other idea, it'll begin to materialize and catch on. But we'll see. We'll need more of your your data and research over time to prove that. And of course, we don't have time, but that's what are we going to do, right? And then in terms of the interfaith stuff, I think you're right that a lot of interfaith stuff is like sort of looking at like, well, can my idea of Jesus fit with the prophet, this sort, these sorts of things, these sort of more doctrinal things. But there are I think examples otherwise. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is really good at who may be a more controversial figure in some parts of the world, but he's done a lot in terms of interfaith dialogue on things like science and the environment and neuroscience and these sorts of things. The Parliament of World Religions, right? That's held not every year, but I can't remember. It's like every few years or so. They focus on issues of not sort of doctrinal interfaith stuff, but how different religions come together to focus on climate change or these sorts of things. So there are, again, examples out there, I think. And you're right. I think that that we spend a lot of time on the human realm, just trying to get to try to prevent violence between different ideologies on the human realm. But again, that's part of, I think, sustainability and environmentalism, right? We can't, human violence against humans is also part of ecological violence, not just because it kills human bodies, but because wars destroy the environments around us, so on and so forth. So it's, I think it's not, these things are not unrelated. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Whitney. Yeah, and then Sarah has quite a number of very good questions.
Yeah, so let's see. I'm just gonna read, so how, this is all in the chat. How the term works, yes, so this is exactly right. So one of the reasons that I want to broaden, so religion itself, right, is created, the idea of religion, just like the idea of science, is created during the era of European colonizations, and it's inherently a colonial sort of way of thinking that hasn't included, in particular, indigenous ways of thinking, other than to say, right, this is the most primitive, right? This is the animism that then evolves into things like monotheism, right? This is what early religious studies philosopher or religious studies scholars have thought, and it's correct, I think, to say that the more animistic and shamanistic traditions of indigenous traditions have been more in tune with places around them, right? And sort of landscape is cultural scape, is when you tell your stories through the places that you live, and this sort of thing. And now I think there's real promise also in the pan-indigenous movements that are coming together against things like the Dakota pipeline and energy extraction and these sorts of things. So I think yes, absolutely. And there's a lot of people, scholars of indigenous traditions, that are looking at sort of forms of neo-animism, and they're calling them neo-animism because they're thinking about it now in terms of like what quantum physics and these sorts of things, through the lens of ecology and through lens of evolution and this sort of thing. But the world is being alive in much the same way that indigenous traditions have argued, right? So I think yes, absolutely, and also in terms of I think helpful in terms of indigenous perspectives is that indigenous peoples and enslaved peoples have lived through apocalypses already, right? They've lived through the end of their world, and there's something to be learned through by groups of people who have already lived through the end of their own world, how to continue living in a world that is no longer there, or that no longer can be, right? So I think that there's also something, as we live through the destruction caused by climate change, that we can learn from peoples who have already experienced the apocalypse of their world. And then reconcile the well-documented violence, misogyny, and genocide perpetuated historically and currently by organized religions with our current needs for, yes. So I don't think that there's a reconciliation. I think that there needs to be a recognition of these sorts of things. And I myself was trained by ecofeminists, right, who looked at patriarchy and heteronormativity, and particularly in the monotheistic traditions, right? And it wasn't, there's not necessarily reconciliation. Those strands are there, but the point is that these traditions are malleable and they can change, right? And so, there weren't women priests, and there still aren't in some traditions, but there are in many traditions now, right? It was I think slavery was justified by certain religions, and now it's hardly justified, right? So I think that, but those phrases and that theology is still there. It's just, you say no, this is not correct, and we expand our understanding of what it means to be human to all humanity, right? Not just men, not just certain types of men, but men and women, and now even trans people, and a whole sort of spectrum of genders in many cases. That's the front edge, right, of this expansion of the circle of moral concern. And I guess what I would say is this: the era that we're in now in terms of religion and ecology is saying, okay, and now we can't just stop at the human realm. We have to expand our ethical and moral concern to include the entire planet, right, and everything therein. So I think it's a continuous growing, not in a linear direction, right? There's always we make 2 steps forward and 2 steps back, and this sort of spike in nationalisms around the world is a step back from my perspective at a moment. But as long as we're alive, we can still have hope that we can live in different worlds by working together and listening to one another, I guess, is what I would say. Sorry to skate your questions there.
Thank you, Whitney. I appreciate that. So I'll just turn it over real quickly to Professor Yahya, if you have any concluding thoughts, and then I'll just turn it over to Professor Bauman to last words, and then I'll close the session.
Yes, thank you. Very wonderful discussion, very insightful, very, I mean, I have got many insights for my future, you can say researches, or for exploring different things. Yes, my concluding thought is, yes, the religion is a very powerful tool, and the religion, the religious principles, it's supporting the environmental protection. It's there. So we have support from there. The only thing we have to do is to handle the challenges, the problems that are around. So yes, that's the good way forward, but we have to do it. So thank you so much, Professor Whitney. Thank you so much, Professor Iqbal.
All right, and turn it over to Whitney.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to reading this article. So no, I really do, and I really appreciate this this groundedness and data, which is a different way than I was trained, and this is part of why I'm glad that Professor Akhtar brought us together, because this is part of why we need multiple perspectives. It's not just about different religious perspectives or different countries and cultures, but also different disciplinary perspectives and different ways of academically looking at the world are so important, I think, in terms of tackling these problems. So thank you so much, and thank you for having me, and thanks for everybody that stuck with it for the last hour.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on, and I think it was a great sort of exchange of ideas. And we're planning on hopefully doing a conference focusing on ideas of pluralism in Pakistan in the summer. So hopefully, Whitney, you can come to Pakistan and you can actually meet Professor Yahya in person. So
I would love that.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, take care. Tomorrow we have our last session, which is going to be with Professor Nathan Katz and Ellen Goldberg, who will be talking about the Jews of Cochin, and the discussant will be Professor Zohaib Ahmed from Islamia University in Bahawalpur, and that will be the last session. It will be a little longer. It'll go on for about an hour and a half, and it'll talk about the Jewish tradition in South Asia. So with that, I will conclude for the evening or the morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining, and hopefully we will stay in touch. I will upload these recordings for everyone to connect with, and at the end of all of the programs tomorrow, then I'll send up a follow-up email with everyone's contact information for the recordings, and for information then eventually sending an email early next year on the virtual exchanges for the spring semester. So if you have any ideas, you're more than welcome to email me. Take care. Have a great day.